From Chicago's CAN TV, this is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there, and welcome to Chicago Newsroom here on CAN TV. I'm Ken Davis, and a happy solstice, everybody. It happened at 5:07 this morning as we tape our show on Thursday at around 10:30. So we're a couple of hours into summer already, and remember, take advantage of this because by Friday, we'll have 1 minute less daylight than we have today. So the decline begins. We always like to look on the bright side here on Chicago Newsroom. And as we begin today, we're all consumed with images of children and babies being distributed all over the country as punishment because their parents thought they might be able to create new, less violent lives in America. But as our dear leader says, we are full up. Go away. And now this morning there's word that maybe while we're recording this very moment, our president is about to merge the Labor Department with the Education Department because, hey, who needs either of them anyway, really, you know? And you heard it here first. Watch out for the next big merger. My prediction, what do you want to bet? He'll make NASA a bureau of the Department of Defense. Finally put all that science to good work building the satellites of war. But hey, speaking of labor, a couple of weeks ago I was part of a panel on a radio discussion, and the topic turned to the fact that unemployment, even though it's at all-time lows, it's really weird that wages aren't rising. It's still really hard to find a job in Chicago with pay high enough that you can live in a decent place and not have rent or mortgage consume more than, about a third of your income. I said I thought one of the biggest factors in the decline of a living wage was the sustained, calculated, and frankly brilliantly engineered assault on collective bargaining in this country over the past couple of decades. In post-war America, the rise of unionization resulted in a broad swath of occupations and trades that paid well and helped distribute this country's stunning wealth a little more evenly. But we boomers who benefited very broadly from that period, well, we didn't live to see our children and our grandchildren enjoy that same growth of wealth. And I think an argument can be made that it's got something to do with union representation. At its peak, 34% of all workers in the United States were unionized. That was in 1954. Today it's around 11%. And here's the interesting part. Almost all of it is workers in the public sphere, people who work for the state, local, federal agencies of some kind. Today, 34% of public workers are unionized, but only 6.5% of private jobs are in the union. So it's no wonder that in the past few years there's been a strong focus on undercutting the power of these public unions, and that's the topic of our show today. We're all sitting on the edge of our seats awaiting the Supreme Court's decision on something called Janus versus AFSCME. And we have two people here with us today who know all about it. Bob Bruno, back on the show again from University of Illinois, professor at the University of Illinois and the Institute for, let's see, I get you confused with the Illinois Policy Institute.
No, you don't want to do that. Please, you don't want to do that.
You are the Illinois.
I'm with the School of Labor and Employment Relations. And inside the school, there is a research shop called the Project for Middle Class Renewal. So we're generating a lot of research and studies.
Yes, you are.
On
and you've done a very good report
you.
Called After Janus, which we're going to be talking about later on today.
Right.
And also making his second appearance on the show today with us, Anders Lindahl from AFSCME, which we all know is the union that is screwing all of us taxpayers, making us pay more money than we should so that you can have fat wages for your teachers and stuff.
With that welcome, I'm so happy to be back.
So, could we just divert everything for a moment to talk about the possibility that the Department of Labor and the Department of Education are being merged? A good idea or a bad idea?
My perspective is it's an absurd idea, and these are two distinct departments with two very focused and different agendas, and any attempt really to merge them, I think, it just hides the intent to shrink the size of government. They're not going to be the two units aren't going to be stronger as one. It's going to weaken really their capacity to invest in children's education and also protect workers in a changing labor market, changing workplaces. So this is a terrible idea, and the intent, I'm sure, is simply to further shrink government services. And I'm not entirely sure there would be much support for actually unifying, or if you will, merging these two.
And
departments.
on that front, I mean, one has to look at what is the agenda behind the scenes here. Where did this come from? What's been publicly reported is that this follows a blueprint laid out by the right-wing corporate-funded Heritage Foundation. And to provide a springboard to the focus of our conversation, it's the same powerful, wealthy corporate interests who are behind the Janus case, are also behind trying to gut our health and education and workforce protections.
Do you find yourself admiring them sometimes? They've done such an incredibly efficient job of doing all of this. I mean, sometimes I just look at this and I say, wow, these seeds were planted 30, 40, 50 years ago, and they have been relentless.
Well, certainly there was a long-term strategy, and it's willful, and millions of dollars have been invested. It's been multi-dimensional. It's focused on local elections. It's focused on state houses. It has a strong attention to the judicial branch of government, all the way up to the Supreme Court. So clearly there is a well-planned, well-funded, long-term strategy to weaken the power of working people to act in some collective form. And the strongest of those forms historically has been the labor movement. So to the degree you can find you can give some credit to maniacal efforts of folks to destroy democracy, these folks are good at doing that.
Is it fair to say that there is not as in physics, an equal and opposite force? I don't see it if it's out there. Is there a long-term, well-funded, well-thought-out wall of resistance to this?
Well, I think you laid out, what that balancing force always was the ability for working people to come together through their unions to have a voice on the job, and also to have a voice in our democracy. By putting together their small contributions, they could counterbalance the big money on the other side. So I think Bob is right to underscore how much wealth and power has been increasingly concentrated in a few in our country, and the runaway, rampant explosion of that income inequality has mirrored the decline in union density that you portrayed in the setup, and that is not an accident.
Ken, I'm reminded that a couple of years ago, a book was published that attempted to assess, what civilian organizations in America best represented the interest of the middle class. And the study looked at both corporate, nonprofit, and labor unions as civil organizations, and then compared what their agendas were and what the best interests of middle class Americans were. And what the author finds, indisputably, is that it was the labor movement whose agenda most mirrored the interest of working and middle class people. And what you further find, that even at only 35% at peak membership, this institution was so effective in actually bringing great benefit and protection to America's evolving middle class. So when we talk about a countervailing power, and industrial labor relations theorists, in fact, do talk about the need for a countervailing power in the workplace and in society, we have to keep in mind that the labor movement has always been that, but it's done it under really never ideal conditions, and it's never been more than 35% of the labor force, and yet it punched way above its weight. So it is the institution. We've never had any other institution that can really do that.
And has been able to bring those benefits not only to its members, but as I'm sure Bob's research has shown,
absolutely,
raises standards, raises wages for all workers, not just those who are union members, but all workers. And this Janus case now, which is a political attack funded behind the scenes and planned as one of a series of Trojan horse cases over the past decade or more to try to rip out the bulwark of the public sector labor movement. It is all about undercutting that, that last vestige of the labor movement for the middle class in this country.
That's at least the focus of our show today, but we probably don't have to spend a lot of time specifically talking about the Janus case, because as your report is, after Janus, what happens after Janus, which is what we really have to talk about, I suppose. But let's just lay the facts out for folks who may not be completely familiar with this. Who is Janus? We know who AFSCME is. That's your union. Who's Janus?
So Mark Janus is an individual, a lone state employee who works in a child support department in Springfield. Someone who has never been a part of the union. Now, under labor law in the public sector, nobody can be required to join the union, and nobody is ever required to pay toward politics. And nothing in this case will change that, despite all of the rhetoric, misleading claims of the other side. However, again, under the law, in the public sector where workers in a particular bargaining unit have voted democratically to be represented by a union, the onus is on the union to represent everyone in the bargaining unit, whether or not they choose to join.
That's required by law.
Exactly. In the case of Mr. Janus, he chose never to join the union, but instead, under a 4-decade-old unanimous Supreme Court precedent, public sector employers and unions have the ability to mutually negotiate what's called a fair share agreement or a fair share fee for those represented individuals who benefit from the contract, who get the wage increases, have the affordable health care, the security and retirement, the fair grievance procedure for process of resolving disputes at work. Individuals like Janus who have never joined the union but still benefit from the contract can be required to pay a percentage of the costs of, not of politics, not of lobbying, but of negotiating and enforcing that contract from which they benefit.
Because if he didn't pay that, then he'd be getting a free ride.
That is the case. I mean, the fair share agreement is founded on the basic principle of fairness that all who benefit, everybody benefits, everybody contributes.
And let me just add that fair share agreement under New Jersey's public sector under Illinois' public sector collective bargaining law, and like other public sector collective bargaining laws, including in New Jersey, the negotiation of that fair share agreement is voluntarily entered into. The governmental unit or the educational unit sits down with the workers' representative and they voluntarily negotiate. The employer agrees to it, and the union.
So they bargain.
That's
part of what they bargain.
And there's a series of exchanges and compromises. And the employer recognizes, as was recognized by the court in 1977 in the precedent-setting case that Anders refers to. They recognize that the employer saw this clause as part of the larger agreement as a smart, rational way to organize the workplace, to handle disputes in the workplace. This is the relationship that the government wanted to have with its employees. And so it was part of good organizational structure and planning and relationships to negotiate this clause. It isn't mandated. It doesn't have to happen this way. The two sides volunteer. So when we...
This has been the status for about 40
years.
Yeah.
And so when you pass a law in a state, a so-called right-to-work law that prohibits this, or when the court issues their ruling and they mandate it universally, what they've essentially said is to say to the employer, to the government, you no longer have the voluntary freedom to decide the best way to organize your workplace and to build a relationship with your employees. It's actually going to compel them to do something they would otherwise not do.
And this is not only why so many employers joined on our side in this case, filing amicus briefs in support of the Abood precedent and
You mean
support of
non-government,
fair share.
private employers?
Public sector employers,
Yeah.
but also why so many constitutional originalists, why libertarian legal scholars also joined. The list of amici who have sided with the union, with working people in the Janus case is across the waterfront, because not only do the public sector employers believe that they should have the ability to manage their labor relations and their workforces in the way that they see fit, but that these originalists, libertarians, think that the courts should not be reaching in to tell localities, municipalities, states how to conduct their business.
Anders, this is all really very nice, but the people who are in charge don't want this, and they're about to change it. And they sent the Janus case all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has indicated every way it possibly can that it's going to shoot this down, and that's going to end it. I did want to just ask one procedural thing, though. We've been hearing for the last 5 weeks that today's the day Janus is going to get announced, and it hasn't been. And we've seen in a couple of rulings recently that the numbers didn't come out quite the way we might have expected that they would. I'm wondering, do you think there's a possibility that there's some kind of internal dispute at the court and they can't quite decide this? Is it possible that Anthony Kennedy is not going to go along with it? Is it possible that the chief judge, who seems to be very respectful of precedent, would say, maybe I can't just go along with this completely changing everything? Is there any chance that it will actually not come down on the negative side?
Well, neither one of us are constitutional scholars, but I think if you take seriously, first of all, the legacy, the history of how this case got to where it got, and you look at the dots and understand how Gorsuch is in the seat that he's in, and how he got there, what his position's likely to be.
He replaced Scalia.
Right. But more importantly, he took a position that was stolen from Merrick Garland because Obama's.
Yeah.
And the same political and corporate interests who funded the campaign to block Garland and install Gorsuch are also funding the Janus.
And they're the same people behind the cases that queued up prior to this one. And then you look at and you read or you listen to the oral arguments, but if you read the transcripts, and I know you can't necessarily always predict, it becomes really clear how hostile Kennedy seemed to be to the precedent, and that it's just highly, highly unlikely that the court is not going to take advantage of this opportunity, because this is not about a legal argument.
But wait a minute.
This is about a political.
The conservative justices, aren't they? They don't like to be activists, right? So they don't want to bring a case in just because it does something they want to do.
And it was precisely.
Right?
No, wait. You're exactly right. And it's precisely that incoherence that led to my writing a piece, an op-ed piece in the Tribune that said, hey, wait a minute, aren't these originalists, aren't these folks who have made a career out of saying judicial activism is a bad thing, right? Yeah. Here you have 40 years of a case. There is not a legal record of how this is a problem. It doesn't exist, right? We're talking minimally 5 million, 6 million workers, thousands of contracts, at least 23 states, and the court is simply going to jump in here, overrule the precedent, and is going to wipe out 23 state collective bargaining laws, impacting millions of workers, thousands of contracts, without a legal record of harm. That seems to me like judicial activism. So how is Alito act? How can he be acting principally if he acts to overturn? How can Gorsuch be acting? How can Thomas be acting principally? It's because they're not making a legal argument. This is a political assault on organized labor.
So you're saying that the Supreme Court has been politicized? Is that what you're saying?
Maybe just a little bit.
Okay, so We don't know, of course. I mean, they're even saying that it might happen today, but who knows? But this whole discussion may be completely, we may just be clueless that as we're sitting here, they're doing it. However,
Hope we're wrong.
the real question, and the reason that I really wanted to ask you both for your wisdom today is on the assumption that Janus succeeds and that it gets shot down. This has been viewed by most people as being just an unmitigated disaster for collective bargaining in the United States. Can we look at it in any other way? Can we hold this thing up to the light and look at it and say, well, maybe it provides an opportunity to rethink the entire way we've been bargaining over the last 40, 50, 60 years? I don't know. Is it?
What we know is, again, these corporate interests that are behind this case. Why are they doing this? When they think that no one outside their right-wing, big money circle is listening, they are very blunt about it. The Guardian has revealed documents from the State Policy Network, which is the national parent of the Illinois Policy Institute here, whose litigation arm has represented the Janus case. And in those documents, they said this case is intended to, and this is a direct quote, defund and defang the labor movement. And why do they want to do that? Again, a direct quote, in order to strike a mortal blow at those movements that speak for working people and at the ultimately electoral prospects for those elected leaders who
they think there's just a bunch of
represent
Democrats.
working people.
Yeah.
Not necessarily just Democrats, but
labor actually can show a good deal of bipartisanship, and that's kind of an unappreciated story, particularly in places like Illinois. But they're looking for elected leaders who, in fact, support a pro-working class, a pro-middle class agenda.
Yeah.
And this is going to make it harder for labor to achieve that. And that ultimate effect is simply to allow the wealthy corporate interests to kind of run wild in an unregulated marketplace.
Yeah.
It really isn't necessarily to elect one kind of leader or another. It's to create a framework where wealth concentrates at the top. That's why the labor movement needs
there's
to be
still,
attacked.
I guess there's still a little bit of wealth that hasn't concentrated to the top, right? So we've got to make sure we get that last drop.
well,
But I actually think, go ahead, Anders. I just think Anders and AFSCME is in a pretty good position to talk about the possibility of a kind of a rebirthing, of a revitalizing.
Yeah, because,
movement.
it's like I'm just looking here. We've been talking for about 20 minutes, and it's all been the doom and gloom portion of the program. And I really wanted that only be about 10 minutes so we could get down and talk about some of the positive things here. And I think that's what we got to do now.
Let's do it.
One quick thing, Anders. I know you got something you want to say, but I loved the idea that several people have written in the last couple of months about these what appear to be spontaneous teacher strikes around the country, and that they are not part of a union. They weren't organized by union organizers. They were organized by, like everything else in our lives, by these things, and that maybe unionism in the next decade is more of a grassroots peer-to-peer electronic communication than it was in our day. What's the story?
Ken, I think there's two things that the wave of teacher uprisings illustrate relevant to this. One is that the idea that if you strip the freedom of working people to negotiate together, somehow you won't engender actually more militant opposition. Somehow you won't engender less cohesion and more upheaval. In these states, many of them don't have collective bargaining rights. Certainly they don't have ability to have strong unions, and yet you have seen this wave of militant activism. So that's one thing. You certainly may see a wave of that if the corporate interests prevail in Janus. That may become more likely, not less likely. But the other thing, and to your point about let's be positive, what the teacher uprising shows, and there's a lot of evidence for this actually, is that unions are needed now more than ever, and working people in America are standing up and demanding their voice through unions now more than they have in decades. Gallup polls on this annually. In the last couple of years, the public approval and the number of workers saying that I would join a union has been higher than it has been in many, many years. And when you break that down, those numbers are highest of all among young people. So, you know, it is a response to a couple of decades of middle-class stagnation or erosion of worker rights on the job.
And we're more and more aware of that now, I think.
And working people more and more are standing together and demanding to have that voice.
One of the things that I've discovered in my conversation with labor leaders and doing some research is that, so this is certainly not a scenario that labor wanted to be in. But there is this opportunity to go back deep inside your own membership, to remind one another what it means when we act collectively, why we need each other, more so now than ever before. So unions like AFSCME and the teacher unions, they have begun a deep dive into their membership, one-on-one conversations, contacting people. And yes, our study suggests one would expect that there will be some defection, there will be some reduction. But maybe what ends up happening is for a short period of time, and these things are always cyclical, right? We're not sure how this is all going to play out years down the road, but maybe you end up with a drop in membership. But what if the members you have now are all activist?
Yeah.
And you have an activist-based movement,
Right.
right? I don't imagine that being a weaker labor movement. I imagine that being a more creative, a more empowered movement in which a worker now is a union member forever because they now understood what the value of that dollar of union dues brought.
And certainly here in Illinois and for AFSCME, and I think for the teachers and others, our experience of the last few years has been one of that kind of deep activism these pitched battles. Our members understand the very stark sides here.
Even if Mr. Janus didn't like what you were doing, the rest of you guys did.
Who brought this case.
We haven't mentioned Bruce Rauner yet. We're all
about the history of it.
Right. I mean, Bruce Rauner is sitting at this table practically. He's so involved in this.
It is Bruce Rauner who brought this case. It is Bruce Rauner who has became governor for no greater purpose than to wipe out the labor movement in Illinois, starting with the public service unions, AFSCME, the service employees, and the teachers. And if there has been an advantage to that, it is that all of our members have been deeply engaged in the last 3, 4, 5 years in these existential fights to protect their jobs from being outsourced for private profit, to protect their affordable health care from Rauner trying to double their premiums overnight, taking $10,000 out of their pocket.
You know, the first time that I really began to have these thoughts was around the time that Rahm Emanuel became mayor and Rauner was soon to be governor. We saw this very concerted effort in the state legislature to really kind of screw the teachers union. I mean, make it so that you can't go on strike without 75%, and then there's the famous call to Mayor Emanuel saying, "We got this." It's like, there'll never be another teacher strike. And I remember reading that and thinking, wow, now there's a red flag. It's like they're basically saying, I dare you to pull together a strike, and that's what happened, right? They got a 90-something% strike vote from people who probably would never have voted 90% if it hadn't been for that challenge. So when you awaken a sleeping giant, sometimes the results are not what you had thought that it would be.
I mean, look no further than Rauner and AFSCME when he brought this case. He brought it at the same time that he issued an executive order to try to bar fair share unilaterally. It was the first day of bargaining our new contract. It was his executive order #1. So again, laying bare what his real agenda was.
Forgot about that,
He said, I am not going to honor fair share agreements, and that was all about trying to drain the resources from the union. That backfired on him. 2,000 state employees came to the union and said, this guy doesn't speak for us,
Right,
and they
right,
signed a
right.
union card.
So your report, Bob, basically predicts that there. I mean, it's very scientific. You can prove that 3.4.5% of people who are in the fair share will drop out, or more people will drop out, and blah blah blah. But the thing that the report cannot quantify is human nature and people saying, "Oh no, you're not.
No, right.
I'm going back in. I want to go back in the union. I'll admit that I've been kind of getting a free pass for the last few years, but okay, I'm back in."
Yeah, yeah.
Can that happen? Does
Yeah.
that? Is there evidence of that?
Well, it's based really this idea that I can free ride, and it's rational for me to do it, is based on the idea that I can do it, but he and she and all of you can't do it, because I do like the benefits.
Right.
I'm just looking for this little advantage, and I get this little bump if I choose not to be in the union.
I
but
want to graze my cow on the commons,
and
as
so
long as he doesn't graze his.
Exactly. So it's this challenge around collective action and how do you address the free rider problem. And so I think when workers really come to understand that there's going to be a degradation of their workplaces and their salaries end up flatlining and they see a loss of income over a period of time, what they're going to understand is that being outside the collective group only weakens them. And so what was rational for me as an individual actually turns out, if everybody thinks that way, to be terrible for all those individuals.
So-
And therefore, we kind of rebuild. We come right back into the fold.
So this thing kind of flips the game. It makes it so that if you are someone who just acts entirely out of self-interest, it can suddenly be in your self-interest to be with these guys.
Yeah. Well, ultimately, it is going to be in your self-interest, because you're going to need the support of one another. You're not going to be able to be an at-will employee and negotiate better working conditions. You're going to need the group. So it's in your self-interest to understand that your power is collectively organized. In fact, if you want any real evidence of that, the oral arguments of the Janus case, it was very clear that the conservative justices were fine if Anders wants to walk into Ken and you're the employer and he wants to negotiate his pay. That's fine, you can do that, and that's not a First Amendment infringement. But if Anders takes me in there and I take another 10 people, wait a minute now. All of a sudden, now it's a First Amendment infringement. Well, the whole point of that is collectively, workers have voice. Singly, they have none. So I think that's a Joe. Isn't that a Joe Hill? I'm getting into a
I
Joe
hear the
Hill
music
song or
swelling
something
in my head.
coming up. Right. So yes, it's in my self-interest to act with my brothers and sisters who are situated like me. They have the same amount of power as I have. We need to bring it all together.
I wanted to touch on one other thing, and I know we're really tight on time, but when you look back on those golden days of the 50s and then look through the 60s and the 70s, public opinion of unions was not that great in many ways. And partly it was because, I think, unions had gotten themselves to the point where they were kind of like part of the same infrastructure as the management. I mean, you have the management of the union in like car plants and that kind of thing, where it's all everything's guaranteed. The wages, the union dues are deducted from your wages. The union people often are just they're kind of like part of the management team almost, in a really kind of perverse sort of way, and it worked against organizing in a certain way, in my opinion. I know in my own family there were people who were saying, the unions are just a bunch of crooks, they're just corrupt, they're just in it for themselves, they don't really care about us. And there was this kind of rotting at the core, which I really don't think is true so much anymore today. And I kind of have this feeling that maybe this is a renaissance for unions and for collective bargaining. Because if it's not, we're really in trouble. But I mean, am I just being crazily optimistic here?
Well, you're inside the state's largest public sector
Well,
union. What's your...
Just speaking from our recent experience, and Bob talked about so many unions having these one-on-one conversations with every member about what this case is really about.
Yeah.
And in those conversations, I think it's clear that AFSCME members, they recognize that, if it hadn't been for the union to litigate it all the way to the state Supreme Court, their pension would have been cut.
Absolutely,
And, if it was not for the union on so many scores, and the union not being disembodied from the members, but if it was not for the members themselves standing together and having that voice through the union, that their lot would be sharply diminished in so many ways. And that in those conversations, it's clear to us that our members understand, two big things on a values level. Number one, that there's a fairness issue here, again, to tie back to the beginning. Everybody benefits from the contract, everybody should contribute, but also that it's only by standing together do we as workers have the strength, have the voice to speak up for ourselves and our families, but also because we're public service workers for the communities that we serve.
And on that latter point, and Ken, this speaks to this idea of a renaissance of collective bargaining. I do think going forward we could see a different approach. And that approach it could be one described as, yes, we bargain, and we're bargaining things that are important to the members we represent. But Anders made the point, there is that community that we serve, right? So that in the public sector particularly, we are bargaining for the public good. We're bargaining for the students in that classroom. We're bargaining for the people that get those services in the variety of ways that you get them. Who other than our people protect the assets of the state of Illinois, who provide, and we do not make a Cadillac living doing it. So going forward, our allies are the community. Our allies are those folks who are the recipients of this. We're not bargaining in a self-interested way, we're bargaining for the public good.
It's a different union, but I do believe that when the history of this epoch is written, at least in Chicago, it's going to be that day with all the red T-shirts on Michigan Avenue, because that was sort of like, that was a day when people started thinking differently about this. That, wow, the teachers are standing up. It's like everybody says that they can't win this, but look at that. There's a collective action going on. And it was a different kind of thing. And you guys have your own stories just like this. But I mean, for us in Chicago, there was this live TV picture that kind of, and by the way, I don't know if, I think it was in your report, Bob, but didn't you or somebody say that the CTU had 900 what are they called, people who don't pay the, what are we talking about? The name just escaped me.
Fee payers.
They were fee payers.
They were fee payers.
Rather than dues payers.
And like exactly what you're saying. They went out and started talking to each one of these people, and they got it down to 400.
So, and a colleague and I wrote a book about the Chicago Teachers Union and their strike in 2012. And what we discovered there, like what AFSCME is certainly doing and has been doing, they took this deep dive into their membership and they built internally, right? They built internally. They knew they had to get that high strike vote. And when in fact they communicated with their members, and they did it on a values-based, here's what we stand for, right? The folks who had been fee payers decided, well, it made sense actually to pay that little extra amount of money and be
can kick that in.
And be all in. So they ended up turning out 20,000, 23,000 people in a strike that nobody thought they could pull off.
And got tremendous support from CPS parents.
And got
I'd say
that
as
too,
a
right,
CPS parent myself.
Right.
Yeah,
That was perhaps the
exactly.
biggest thing. And of course, nobody was more surprised than Rahm Emanuel, right? Because he thought he and his buddy, the governor of Illinois, they'd got this all figured out. But it didn't work out
I mean,
that
maybe
way.
this is a good place to end it, but I just think that idea of how the whole community benefits when public service workers have a strong voice is so important. It's, this attack that Janus represents is not just a wake-up call to anybody that cares about a more equitable and just society, because unions raise standards for everyone, especially workers of color, especially women, et cetera. But it also is about defending public services in our communities, the way that AFSCME represented therapists fought to protect the mental health clinics in every neighborhood, the way that AFSCME library workers fought to protect library hours in their neighborhoods, and the way the CTU teachers have done, and not just the teachers, but all the educators have done to protect the schools in all the neighborhoods too.
There is a sense that this is kind of like it's the last resort. It's like, okay, we're gonna have to fight back, and this is a good place to start the fight. I don't know.
Good as any.
Yep. Well, guys, I just really appreciate you coming by. This conversation will never end, and we'll see how Janus goes. Wouldn't it be something, though? Wouldn't it be something if Roberts says,
so
I can't do this, it's a precedent.
I think there's like a half or 1/100th of a 1% that maybe the justices would come back and say, well, we're going to uphold Abood, but we're going to draw the line a little bit differently in terms of what is considered germane to collective bargaining, and that spending's okay, and what would be not okay because it would be political lobbying. And so AFSCME's going to have to keep the records a little differently. But that really does seem to be like a Hail Mary.
But what I'm reading from both of you is that no matter if Janus comes out 9-0, it's still not the end. And what it is really the beginning of a whole different chapter.
It's a new chapter,
and
you're right.
That is a good place for us to end.
Sure.
And we'll
Anders,
come back and discuss it.
I'm looking forward to it.
We'll have to make it like a regular feature
Let's do
here,
that.
that's all.
Let's do that.
Anders Lindall from the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, AFSCME.
Nailed it.
We just say it so often we don't know what it really is. And Bob Bruno from the University of Illinois, and the author of the After Janus report. Just so glad to have you both here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Come back again sometime. And to you, dear viewer, next week our guest is going to be Pat Quinn. So we're going to have a lot to talk about. Does Pat Quinn really want to throw Rahm Emanuel out of office with his petition? That is going to be an interesting little battle there. And we'll talk about that and many, many other things. Hope you'll come back for Chicago Newsroom next week. And remember, this is the place to go if you want to see any of our past shows or watch this show or listen to us on SoundCloud. There are a million ways to do it. You can subscribe and all that, and all the instructions are there. So please do that. We'll see you next week on Chicago Newsroom. I'm Ken Davis. Thank you very much for watching. Bye for now.